The rain was falling hard on the narrow streets of old Kyoto that Tuesday evening. Kenji pulled his expensive coat tighter as he hurried down the wet pavement, looking for somewhere warm to eat. He had been in back-to-back meetings all day, and his stomach was growling loudly. Most of the fancy restaurants in the business district were already closing, and he didn't want to eat alone in another sterile hotel restaurant. That's when he spotted the small wooden sign hanging outside a tiny restaurant. The paint was old and faded, but the warm yellow light spilling from the windows looked inviting. Through the foggy glass, he could see families sitting around low tables, sharing meals and laughing together. It was exactly the opposite of the cold conference rooms he'd been stuck in all day. Kenji pushed open the heavy wooden door, and a little bell jingled above his head. The smell of grilled fish and miso soup immediately made his mouth water. The restaurant was small and cozy, with maybe 15 tables total. Paper lanterns hung from the ceiling, casting soft shadows on the dark wood walls. It felt like stepping back in time. An elderly man with kind eyes and calloused hands approached him with a slight bow. This was Hiroshi, the restaurant owner who had been running this place for over 30 years. He looked a bit surprised to see someone in such an expensive suit in his humble restaurant, but his smile was genuine and welcoming. "Good evening, sir. Please come in from the rain," Hiroshi said, gesturing toward an empty table near the window. "We have fresh mackerel tonight, caught this morning." Kenji nodded gratefully and followed him to the table. As he settled into the cushioned seat, he couldn't help but notice how different this place felt from his usual dining spots. There were no fancy decorations or trendy lighting, just honest, simple food and the comfortable chatter of regular customers who clearly felt at home here. That's when he first saw her. Yuki emerged from the kitchen carrying a wooden tray loaded with steaming bowls. She moved gracefully between the tables, somehow managing to balance multiple dishes while navigating the narrow spaces between customers. Her uniform was simple and clean, and her long black hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail. But there was something about the way she carried herself that caught Kenji's attention. She approached his table with a warm smile that reached her eyes. "Welcome to our restaurant," she said softly, setting down a small cup of tea without being asked. "This is on the house. You look like you've had a long day." Kenji was touched by this small gesture of kindness. In his world of business deals and networking events, genuine warmth was rare. "Thank you," he said, surprised by how much he meant it. "That's very thoughtful." As Yuki explained the evening's specials, Kenji found himself really listening. She spoke about each dish with obvious pride, describing how Hiroshi prepared everything fresh each day using recipes passed down through his family. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and Kenji realized he was actually excited about his dinner for the first time in months. While waiting for his food, Kenji observed the restaurant more carefully. The other customers were clearly regulars. Office workers stopping by after long days, elderly couples sharing quiet meals, a young mother feeding her toddler while chatting with friends. Everyone seemed to know each other, and there was a sense of community that he rarely experienced in his own life. But it was the piano in the far corner that really caught his eye. The instrument was old, probably from the 1960s, with dark wood that had seen better days. Dust had settled on its surface and sheet music was scattered haphazardly on top. It looked forgotten, like a beautiful piece of furniture that had lost its purpose. Yet something about it seemed to call out, as if it was waiting patiently for someone to remember what it was meant for. When Yuki returned with his grilled fish and rice, Kenji couldn't resist asking about it. "That piano over there, does anyone ever play it?" Yuki's eyes immediately shifted to the instrument, and for just a moment, her professional smile faltered. Something flickered across her face. Longing, maybe, or sadness. But it was gone so quickly that Kenji almost wondered if he'd imagined it. "Oh, that old thing," she said with a forced lightness. "It belonged to the previous owner. Hiroshi-san keeps saying he should get rid of it, but somehow he never gets around to it. Takes up a lot of space, really." But Kenji noticed the way her fingers unconsciously moved as she spoke, as if they were remembering something her words wouldn't say. And when she thought he wasn't looking, her gaze drifted back to the piano with an expression he recognized. the same look he used to have when staring at expensive cars he couldn't afford as a young man. As the evening went on, Kenji found himself watching Yuki work. She served every customer with the same gentle attention, remembering how each person liked their tea, asking about their families, making everyone feel special. But every so often, during quiet moments between orders, her eyes would wander to that dusty piano in the corner. Other staff members occasionally made jokes about the old instrument. Maybe we should turn it into a flower planter, one of the cooks called out during a lull. At least then it would be useful for something. Yuki's face tightened slightly at the comment, but she said nothing. She simply continued wiping down tables, her movements perhaps a bit more brisk than before. The rain had stopped by the time Kenji finished his meal, but he found himself reluctant to leave. There was something about this place, about the warmth and authenticity, that he didn't want to give up just yet. In his fast-paced world of technology and finance, moments of genuine human connection were precious and rare. As he sat there nursing his final cup of tea, an elderly customer at a nearby table started telling a story about his grandson's piano recital. The pride in the old man's voice was unmistakable as he described the boy's performance. How nervous he'd been, but how beautifully he'd played. Kenji glanced at Yuki, who had paused in her work to listen. The longing in her expression was so clear, so raw that it made his chest tighten. Here was someone who clearly had dreams beyond this small restaurant, dreams that seemed to center around that forgotten piano in the corner. When it came time to pay his bill, Kenji left a generous tip, but more than that, he left with questions. Who was this young woman who served tea with such grace and looked at an old piano like it held all her secrets? What was her story, and why did he feel like there was so much more to her than met the eye? As he walked back into the cool night air, Kenji made a mental note of the restaurant's location. Something told him he would be back soon, drawn not just by the excellent food, but by the mystery of the waitress who looked at that dusty piano like it was her whole world. 3 weeks later, Kenji found himself back at the small restaurant. His business in Kyoto had extended longer than expected, and somehow he kept returning to this cozy place. The food was excellent, but if he was being honest, it was more than that. There was something about the atmosphere, about Yuki's quiet kindness that drew him back again and again. Tonight felt different, though. The restaurant was busier than usual, filled with what seemed like after-work crowds and a few tourists who had discovered this hidden gem. Kenji sat at his usual table by the window, watching Yuki navigate between the packed tables with her characteristic grace. But he noticed something else tonight. The other staff members seemed more talkative, more relaxed, and unfortunately, more willing to share their opinions loudly. "Hey, Yuki," called out Takeshi, one of the younger waiters, as he balanced a tray of empty dishes. "My girlfriend says she saw you at the music store again last week, still pretending you're going to be a famous pianist?" A few customers at nearby tables looked up with amused smiles. Yuki's cheeks flushed pink, but she kept her voice steady. "I was just looking around," she said quietly, continuing to wipe down a table. "Looking around?" laughed Michiko, the restaurant's other waitress. "Come on, Yuki, everyone knows you spend your lunch break staring at those expensive pianos through the shop window like some lovesick teenager." The comment drew chuckles from several customers. Kenji felt his jaw tighten. He could see how uncomfortable Yuki was becoming. The way her movements had grown stiffer, more hurried. An older businessman at a corner table joined in with a patronizing smile. "There's nothing wrong with having dreams, young lady, but at your age, isn't it time to be more realistic? Some of us are born for music and some of us are born to serve it." "Exactly," agreed his dining companion, a well-dressed woman with perfectly styled hair. "My daughter took piano lessons for 10 years and still couldn't play anything worth listening to. It takes talent, real talent, not just wishful thinking." Yuki's hand trembled slightly as she poured tea for another table. Kenji watched her struggle to maintain her composure, and something inside him began to burn. These people had no idea what they were talking about, no idea who they were dismissing so casually. The conversation might have died down, but Takeshi wasn't finished. "Remember when she told us she went to music school?" he said loudly enough for half the restaurant to hear. I mean, if that was true, why would she be working here? No offense, Hiroshi-san, but this isn't exactly the career path for a conservatory graduate. Even Hiroshi, the kind restaurant owner, looked uncomfortable now. Takeshi, perhaps we should— No, it's fine, Takeshi continued, clearly enjoying the attention. We're all friends here. Yuki knows we're just teasing. Right, Yuki? Tell everyone about your secret musical talents. The mockery in his voice was unmistakable. Several customers were now openly staring, waiting to see how this would play out. Yuki stood frozen near the kitchen door holding an empty tray, her face burning with embarrassment. That's when Kenji stood up. The scrape of his chair against the wooden floor cut through the chatter like a knife. Every eye in the restaurant turned to him. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his wallet, his movements deliberate and confident. I'll tell you what, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet room. I'm a businessman, and I believe in putting my money where my mouth is. He pulled out a thick stack of bills and set them on his table with a sharp slap that made everyone jump. 100,000 yen, right here, right now, for anyone who can sit at that piano and play something beautiful. The silence that followed was deafening. 100,000 yen was more than most of these people made in a month. Every eye shifted from the money to the dusty piano in the corner, then back to Kenji. You're serious? Asked the businessman who had made the earlier comment. About talent. Dead serious, Kenji replied, not taking his eyes off Yuki. But it has to be beautiful. Really beautiful, not just noise. The restaurant erupted in nervous laughter and whispered conversations. Several customers looked tempted by the money, but when they glanced at the piano, their confidence seemed to evaporate. Most of them probably hadn't touched a piano since childhood lessons they'd abandoned decades ago. What's the catch? Asked Michiko suspiciously. No catch, Kenji said simply. Play something beautiful, take the money, it's that simple. Takeshi laughed nervously. Man, I wish I'd paid attention in those piano lessons my mom forced me to take. Easy money, right there. So go play, challenged the businessman. Show us what you've got. But Takeshi's laughter became more forced. Hey, I never claimed to be a musician, I'm just a waiter. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The same people who had been mocking Yuki's musical dreams were now making excuses for their own lack of ability. But the money sat there on the table, real and tempting. Then someone called out from the back of the restaurant. What about Yuki? She's the one who's always talking about music. All eyes turned to her again. Yuki looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. Her hands were shaking now, and she seemed to be having trouble breathing. Oh, come on, said Michiko with a cruel smile. Yuki wouldn't dare. She knows the difference between daydreaming and reality. Yeah, agreed Takeshi, his earlier nervousness forgotten now that the spotlight was off him. It's one thing to pretend in private, but this is real money. This gentleman obviously knows music when he hears it. The businessman nodded sagely. Exactly. 100,000 yen isn't pocket change. He wouldn't risk it unless he was confident no one here could actually play. Smart money says he keeps his cash, added his companion with a smug smile. But Kenji kept his gaze fixed on Yuki. He could see the war playing out across her face, the desire to prove them all wrong battling against years of keeping her dreams hidden, the fear of public humiliation wrestling with something deeper, something that looked almost like desperate hope. I mean, look at her, Takeshi continued mercilessly. She can barely hold that tray steady. You think she could handle playing piano in front of all of us? She'd probably faint before she hit the first note. More laughter rippled through the crowd. But Kenji noticed that Yuki's eyes had shifted to the piano. For the first time tonight, she was looking directly at it, and something in her expression had changed. The mockery continued around her, but she seemed to have stopped hearing it. Her gaze was fixed on those dusty keys, and her hands had stopped, shaking. In fact, her whole body had gone very still, as if she was listening to something only she could hear. Kenji held his breath. This was the moment. This was when she would either retreat into safety or step forward into the unknown. The money sat on the table, the crowd waited with eager cruelty, and that old piano sat in the corner like a challenge that had been waiting 30 years for someone brave enough to accept it. The next few seconds would change everything. The restaurant had never been this quiet. Even the kitchen staff had stopped their work to peek through the service window. Everyone was staring at Yuki, waiting to see what she would do. The stack of money sat on Kenji's table like a dare, and that old piano waited in the corner like a sleeping giant. Yuki's hands weren't shaking anymore. That was the first thing Kenji noticed. Just moments ago she could barely hold her tray steady, but now she stood perfectly still, staring at the piano with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Well?" Takeshi called out, his voice breaking. The tension. "Are you going to try, or should we all get back to work?" A few people chuckled nervously, but most kept watching Yuki. There was something about her stillness that made even the cruelest mockers hesitate. Slowly, very slowly, Yuki set down her tray on an empty table. The simple action seemed to echo in the silent room. She wiped her hands on her apron, a gesture so normal and yet somehow significant that it made everyone hold their breath. "She's actually going to do it," whispered someone near the back. "This should be interesting," muttered the businessman, pulling out his phone. "I've got to record this." Within seconds, half the restaurant had their phones out. Kenji felt a flash of anger at their readiness to capture what they expected to be her humiliation, but he said nothing. This was Yuki's moment, whatever it would bring. She took her first step toward the piano, then another. Each step seemed to cost her something, but also seemed to give her something back. Her shoulders straightened slightly with each movement. "Oh my God, she's really doing this," Michiko whispered to Takeshi. "I almost feel bad for her." "Don't," Takeshi whispered back. She brought this on herself with all that dreaming nonsense. But their whispers died as Yuki reached the piano bench. The old wooden seat creaked as she sat down, her waitress uniform looking strangely formal against the instrument's dark wood. She placed her hands in her lap and stared at the keys for a long moment. The dust on the piano was thick. No one had touched these keys in months, maybe years. Yuki reached out tentatively and wiped the surface clean with her sleeve, her movements gentle and reverent like she was touching something sacred. "Any day now," called out someone from the crowd, followed by scattered laughter. But Yuki seemed to be in her own world now. She adjusted her position on the bench, tested the pedals with her feet, and flexed her fingers slightly. These were small movements, but Kenji noticed them. They looked practiced, professional even. Then she lifted her hands to the keyboard. The first note that came out was soft, almost hesitant. It was a single key held for just a moment before releasing. The sound was clean and pure, cutting through the restaurant's atmosphere like morning sunlight through fog. Several people shifted impatiently. One note wasn't a song. Anyone could hit one note. But then came the second note, and the third, and suddenly, unmistakably, music began to fill the room. It started quietly, almost like a whisper. The melody was simple but heartbreakingly beautiful. Kenji recognized it immediately, Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. It was a piece that required not just technical skill but soul. It was a piece that separated real pianists from people who just knew how to press keys. The change in the room was instant and dramatic. The scattered conversation stopped mid-sentence. Phones that had been raised to record her failure were slowly lowered as people forgot why they were holding them. Even the kitchen staff came out to listen, their faces showing the same shock as everyone else. But Yuki was just getting started. As the piece progressed, her playing became more confident, more expressive. Her fingers moved across the keys with a grace that seemed impossible for someone who supposedly hadn't touched a real piano in years. The notes flowed together like water, each one perfectly placed, perfectly timed. The businessman who had been so ready to mock her was now staring, with his mouth slightly open. The woman beside him had forgotten entirely about her earlier comments about talent and breeding. Even Takeshi had gone completely silent, his face pale with shock. This wasn't just competent playing. This was extraordinary. Yuki's whole body seemed to be part of the music now. Her shoulders moved with the rhythm. Her face showed every emotion. The piece demanded. When the melody called for sadness, her expression reflected it. When it called for hope, she seemed to glow from within. Kenji found himself holding his breath. He had hoped she could play, had sensed something in her that others missed. But this was beyond anything he had imagined. This was the kind of playing that belonged in concert halls, not dusty corner restaurants. The technical passages that would trip up most amateur players flowed effortlessly under her fingers. The delicate decorations that made Chopin so beautiful were rendered with perfect precision. But more than the technique, it was the emotion that captivated everyone. This wasn't just music. It was storytelling without words. As the piece moved toward its climax, Yuki's playing became more passionate, more intense. Her fingers flew over the keys with confidence that seemed to grow with every measure. The old piano, neglected for so long, seemed to be singing with joy at finally being played by someone who truly understood it. An elderly customer near the front had tears in her eyes. A young father had stopped feeding his toddler, both of them, mesmerized by the music. Even the teenagers who had been scrolling through their phones were now watching with complete attention. The most remarkable thing was Yuki herself. The nervous, embarrassed waitress from moments before had vanished completely. In her place sat a true musician, someone who belonged at that piano, someone for whom music was clearly not just a hobby or a dream, but a fundamental part of who they were. As the piece approached its gentle, wistful ending, the entire restaurant seemed to lean forward. No one wanted this moment to end. The music had transformed not just Yuki, but everyone who heard it. The harsh laughter and cruel comments from earlier seemed like they had happened in a different world, to different people. The final notes rang out in the sudden silence, each one clear and perfect. Yuki held the last chord for exactly the right amount of time before lifting her hands from the keys. The sound faded slowly, leaving behind a silence that was completely different from the mocking quiet of a few minutes earlier. This silence was full of awe. For several heartbeats, no one moved. No one spoke. No one even seemed to breathe. They were all processing what they had just witnessed, trying to understand how the person they thought they knew could have been hiding such extraordinary talent. Yuki sat very still at the piano bench, her hands now folded in her lap again. But she was different now. The transformation wasn't just in how others saw her. It was in how she carried herself. She sat straighter, breathed deeper, looked more alive than anyone had ever seen her. The silence stretched on, filled with wonder, and the lingering echo of beauty that had just filled their small world. The silence broke like a dam bursting. The entire restaurant erupted in thunderous applause. People who had been sitting down jumped to their feet. Others who had been ready to mock her just minutes before were now clapping so hard their hands hurt. The sound was deafening after the gentle beauty of the music. "Oh my God," breathed Michiko, her face completely white. "Oh my God, Yuki, I had no idea." Takeshi looked like he'd been slapped. He stood there with his mouth open, unable to form words. The cruel jokes he'd been making just minutes earlier seemed to hang in the air between them, suddenly heavy with shame. The businessman who had pulled out his phone to record her failure was now frantically trying to restart the recording. "Did anyone get that?" he called out desperately. "Please tell me someone recorded that." But Yuki seemed almost unaware of the reaction around her. She sat at the piano bench, staring down at the keys with tears streaming down her face. Not tears of embarrassment or fear like before, but something deeper. Relief, maybe, or grief, or joy. It was impossible to tell. Kenji was the first to approach her. He moved slowly, carefully, like someone approaching a wild animal that might flee at any sudden movement. The applause was still thundering around them, but he only had eyes for Yuki. He started, then stopped. Words felt inadequate after what they'd just witnessed. That was extraordinary. Yuki looked up at him with those tear-filled eyes, and for the first time since he'd known her, she looked completely unguarded. All her careful politeness, Her professional smile, her quiet way of blending into the background, it was all gone. What remained was raw and real and beautiful. "I haven't played a real piano in 4 years," she whispered, her voice so soft he had to lean closer to hear her. 4 years, 2 months, and 16 days. The specificity of that answer hit him, like a punch to the chest. She had been counting. All this time, serving tables and pouring tea and enduring mockery about her dreams, she had been counting every single day since she'd last touched real keys. Hiroshi, the restaurant owner, pushed through the crowd with tears in his own eyes. His weathered hands were shaking as he reached out to touch Yuki's shoulder. "Child," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Why didn't you ever tell us? All these months, all these years, and you never said—" Yuki wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving streaks across her cheeks. "What was I supposed to say? That I spent 8 years at the Tokyo Conservatory? That I graduated with honors? That I was supposed to debut with the National Symphony Orchestra?" The crowd, which had been chattering excitedly, went quiet again. These weren't the credentials of someone who played piano as a hobby. This was the background of a serious, professional musician. "The Tokyo Conservatory?" repeated the businessman, his voice filled with awe. That's one of the most prestigious music schools in the world. You can't just buy your way in there." Yuki nodded, fresh tears starting to fall. "I was 22 when I graduated. I had everything planned out. Auditions lined up, a manager interested in representing me, even a small apartment near the concert hall picked out." Her voice broke slightly. "I was going to be a real pianist, a real musician, not just someone who dreamed about it." "What happened?" asked an elderly woman who had pushed to the front of the crowd. Her voice was gentle, grandmotherly. Yuki was quiet for so long that people began to think she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her words came out in a rush, like she'd been holding them back for years. "My parents died in a car accident 3 weeks before my debut concert." 3 weeks? She laughed bitterly. "The funeral was on the same day I was supposed to perform Rachmaninoff's second piano concerto with the orchestra. Instead of wearing my concert dress, I was wearing black at a cemetery." The restaurant was so quiet now that they could hear the rain that had started falling outside. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, afraid that any sound might stop her from continuing. "After the funeral, I found out about the debts they'd hidden from me, the medical bills from my father's treatments, the loans they'd taken out to pay for my education, the mortgage on our house that was months behind." Yuki's hands clenched in her lap. Everything was gone overnight. The apartment I'd picked out, the debut concert, the manager who had been so interested, none of it mattered anymore. She looked around the restaurant, at all the faces staring back at her with new understanding. "And then there was grandmother." "Your grandmother?" Kenji asked gently. "She raised my father after his parents died young. When my parents were gone, she was all I had left, and I was all she had. But she was already in her 80s, already starting to forget things, already needing more care than she could ask for." Yuki's voice grew stronger, more determined. "I couldn't put her in a home. I couldn't abandon her the way everyone else in her life had been taken away. The pieces were falling into place for everyone listening. This wasn't a story of someone who had given up on their dreams out of laziness or fear. This was someone who had sacrificed everything for love and responsibility. So I took the first job I could find that would let me work double shifts. I sold my piano to pay for grandmother's medicine. I moved us into a tiny apartment where the walls are so thin, I can't even practice on a keyboard without disturbing the neighbors." She gestured around the restaurant. "And I've been here ever since, serving tea and listening to people talk about how silly it is to have dreams you can't afford." Takeshi looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. "Yuki, we didn't know." "If we had known—" "Known what?" she asked, not unkindly but not letting him off the hook either. "Would it have made the jokes less funny? Would it have made my situation less pathetic?" "It's not pathetic," said the elderly woman firmly. "Taking care of family is never pathetic. Sacrificing your dreams for someone you love, that's not pathetic, dear. That's noble. Several people in the crowd nodded agreement, but Yuki shook her head. Noble doesn't pay the bills. Noble doesn't cure grandmother's dementia. Noble doesn't bring back the 4 years I've lost, or the career that's probably gone forever. But you still practice, Kenji observed. You said you haven't played a real piano, but you still practice. For the first time since she'd started talking, Yuki smiled slightly. I have a cheap electronic keyboard that I bought secondhand. No sound comes out when I press the keys. I can't afford to disturb the neighbors, but I can still feel the music in my fingers. Every night after grandmother goes to sleep, I sit in our tiny kitchen and play silent concerts for an audience of one. The image of her sitting alone, playing soundless music on a silent keyboard, hit everyone in the room with devastating clarity. All those nights, all those years, keeping her dreams alive through pure muscle memory and stubborn hope. The calluses on my fingers never fully fade, she continued, holding up her hands. And my grandmother, in her few clear moments, sometimes asks me to play for her. She doesn't remember much anymore, but she remembers that I used to make beautiful music. So I play on that silent keyboard, and she smiles and nods along to melodies only we can hear. There wasn't a dry eye in the restaurant now. The same people who had been ready to humiliate her were now seeing her with completely new eyes. This wasn't just a waitress who had surprised them with hidden talent. This was a master musician who had been hiding in plain sight, carrying an enormous burden with grace and dignity they hadn't even noticed. Kenji stood there for a long moment, looking at Yuki with an expression that no one in the restaurant could quite read. The stack of money still sat on his table, but somehow it seemed insignificant now compared to what they had all just witnessed and learned. "The 100,000 yen is yours," he said finally, his voice cutting through the emotional silence. "You more than earned it." But instead of reaching for the money, Yuki shook her head. "I can't take it. I didn't do this for money. I did it because I needed to remember who I used to be." "Then let me ask you something different," Kenji said, pulling out his business card. "Do you know who I am?" Yuki looked at the card and her eyes widened slightly. Everyone else leaned forward, curious. The card was simple but elegant, with just a name and a company logo that some people recognized. "You're the CEO of that tech company," whispered someone in the crowd. "The one that's been in all the business magazines." Kenji nodded. "I built my company from nothing. 15 years ago, I was sleeping on friends' couches and eating convenience store noodles for every meal. I know what it's like to have dreams that feel impossible." He paused, looking around the restaurant at all the faces watching him. "I also know talent when I see it. And what I just heard wasn't just talent, it was mastery, the kind that comes from years of dedication and sacrifice." "But what does that matter now?" Yuki asked, her voice small. "I'm 28 years old. I've been out of the music world for 4 years. Do you know how fast things move in classical music? There are teenagers debuting with orchestras now who were barely learning scales when I graduated." "Age is just a number," said the elderly woman who had spoken earlier. "I didn't start painting until I was 60, and now my work hangs in galleries. It's never too late to chase your dreams again." But Yuki looked overwhelmed by the very idea. "You don't understand. It's not just about age. It's about connections, about staying relevant, about having the money for auditions and the right clothes and the right opportunities. It's about having time to practice 8 hours a day and travel to competitions and—" "What if I told you that you didn't have to worry about any of that?" Kenji interrupted gently. The restaurant went quiet again. Yuki stared at him, afraid to hope but unable to stop herself from listening. "I'm offering to sponsor your return to music," he continued. "Full sponsorship. Money for your grandmother's care so you don't have to worry about her. Money for you, to practice and audition and rebuild your career. Money for the best teachers, the best opportunities, whatever you need." The silence that followed was deafening. Several people gasped audibly. Takeshi looked like he might faint. Even Hiroshi was staring with his mouth open. "Why?" Yuki whispered. "Why would you do that for a stranger?" Kenji smiled, and for the first time since he'd walked into the restaurant weeks ago, he looked completely relaxed. "Because 15 years ago, Someone took a chance on me when no one else would. A businessman who saw something in my ideas when everyone else said I was crazy. He invested in my company when I had nothing but dreams and determination. He gestured around the restaurant. He didn't just give me money. He gave me the chance to prove that my dreams were worth pursuing. That investment changed my life, and it built the company that employs hundreds of people today. That's different, Yuki protested. Business is different from music. You can measure success in business. You can see profits and growth and can. You? Kenji challenged. Because right now in this moment everyone in this restaurant has been changed by what you just played. Look around you. Yuki did look around, and what she saw surprised her. The businessman who had been so ready to mock her was wiping tears from his eyes. Michiko was holding Takeshi's hand, both of them looking ashamed and amazed at the same time. The young mother was holding her toddler closer, as if the music had reminded her of something precious about life. Music changes people, Kenji continued. It heals them, inspires them, makes them remember what's beautiful in the world. How do you measure the value of that? How do you put a price on touching someone's soul? The elderly woman stepped forward, her voice shaky with emotion. My husband died 6 months ago. We were married for 52 years, and I haven't felt anything but sadness since he passed. But listening to you play just now, for those few minutes, I remembered what joy felt like. I remembered why life is worth living. Several other people nodded, sharing their own quiet revelations about what the music had meant to them. A teenager mentioned that it reminded her of her grandfather's piano lessons. A businessman said it made him think about the dreams he'd given up too easily. But my grandmother, Yuki said, the practical concerns still weighing on her. I can't just abandon her. She's all I have. You wouldn't be abandoning her, Kenji assured her. Part of the sponsorship would be hiring the best care for her, physical therapy, memory exercises, whatever helps. And when you're in town, you'd still spend time with her, but you'd also be pursuing the career you sacrificed for her sake. The restaurant owner, Hiroshi, stepped forward with tears in his eyes. Yuki, you have to do this, not just for yourself, but for everyone who's ever had to choose between their dreams and their responsibilities. Show them it's possible to have both. The momentum in the room was building. People were pulling out their phones, not to mock this time, but to capture this moment of transformation. Someone in the back called out, "You have to try, you owe it to yourself." But what if I'm not good enough anymore? Yuki asked, the fear finally showing through her brave facade. What if 4 years away from the stage has ruined everything? What if I audition and fail spectacularly? What if this is all just a beautiful dream that falls apart the moment I step back into the real music world? Kenji walked over to the piano and sat down next to her on the bench. Then you'll fail spectacularly, learn from it and try again. That's what pursuing dreams means. Risking failure for the chance at something extraordinary. He placed his hand gently on the piano keys. But I don't think you'll fail. I think you'll surprise yourself with how much you've retained, how much you've grown even during these years away. Sometimes time away from something helps us appreciate it more, understand it deeper. Besides, added Michiko, her voice humble now, you just played a piece that brought grown adults to tears after not touching a real piano for 4 years. If that's what you can do, Rusty, imagine what you can do with proper training and practice. Again. The businessman who had recorded part of her performance held up his phone. I got the last minute of your playing. It's already been viewed 50 times just from the people here posting it online. The comments are incredible. People are asking who you are, where they can hear more. Social media moves fast these days, added another customer. If this video gets shared widely, you might have opportunities coming to you before you even start looking for them. Yuki looked around the room one more time, at all these faces that had gone from mockery to support in the span of one song. She thought about her grandmother, sitting alone in their tiny apartment, sometimes asking about the music that used to fill their lives. She thought about her silent keyboard and all those nights of practicing melodies no one could hear. Finally, she turned to Kenji, her voice steady for the first time all evening. If I say yes, if I take this chance, I want to do something first. What's that? I want to give a concert. Here in this restaurant, for everyone who's supported me and everyone who's doubted me, I want to show grandmother that her granddaughter is still a musician, even after all these years of silence. The entire restaurant erupted in cheers and applause. Hiroshi was already talking excitedly about moving tables to make room for a proper performance space. Customers were volunteering to help promote the event, to invite friends and family. The excitement swirled around them. Kenji smiled and extended his hand to Yuki. So do we have a deal? Are you ready to chase your dreams again? Yuki looked at his outstretched hand, then at the piano keys beneath her fingers, then at all the people who had become believers in her story. She took a deep breath, feeling lighter than she had in 4 years. Yes, she said, shaking his hand firmly. Let's make some music. And in that moment, everyone in the small restaurant knew they had witnessed something truly special. Not just the rebirth of a musical career, but the power of second chances, the importance of believing in each other, and the way a single song can change everything.